What is going on, everybody? Cryo here, and I know I've been away for a while, but don't worry, we are back. Shadowlands once again has a hard release date of November 23rd, and I want to make sure that you guys have everything you need to hit the ground running. Continuing with our dungeon guide overviews, today we're taking a look at the Sanguine Depths, checking out notable trash mobs and boss mechanics. Without wasting any more time, let's get it. On your way to the first boss, you will encounter Noble Skirmisher. Most notably, these mobs will cast Animate Weapon. Tanks, just be sure to pick them up. The Famished Ticks. These cast Thrash, dealing minor physical damage. Dreadful Huntmaster. Watch out for their Volatile Trap. They will also cast Dread Shot, which will deal some shadow damage, but unless you stun or displace the mob, it's uninterruptible. So just be ready for the damage. Regal Mistdancer. This mob will periodically buff his allies with Sanctified Mists. This is a ground effect, and the mobs should be dragged out of it. The mist itself will deal ticking damage to players and cause enemies to deal 50% increased damage. Mistdancers will also cast Echoing Thrust. This is a frontal blast that should be sidestepped out of. Insatiable Brute. Tanks will take a decent amount of physical damage from Slam. Nothing too major though. Party members should watch out for Umbral Crash. This ability is telegraphed with a large blue swirly and is easily avoided. If you do manage to get squashed, you will not only take shadow damage, but the brute will also leech health and heal up a bit. Gluttonous Tick. These do exactly what you'd expect ticks to do. They mainly cast Engorge, dealing damage to their target but also buffing themselves with Engorge. The longer the cast, the more stacks the tick gains and the larger it becomes. Once the tick dies or reaches 20 stacks, it will explode, dealing massive AoE damage based on the number of stacks it had. Do your best to manage the stacks and remove them if you can. Grubby Dirt Cruncher. This mob is yellow, however it will most likely get pulled by accident, and they will make an appearance later on in the dungeon, so why not learn about them now. They will mainly melee the tank and occasionally cast Bonk. These can also be motivated by a mob, which we will talk about later. Kryxis the Voracious marks our first boss encounter and has a little something for everyone. Starting with the tanks, the Tank Buster will be Vicious Headbutt. This will deal heavy physical damage and knock you backwards. Make sure you are not hanging out by the edge or you will be launched off. It's best to have your back towards a wall. The party as a whole needs to interrupt Hungering Drain ASAP. The boss drains the essence out of all players nearby, inflicting shadow damage and allows Kryxis to gain applications of Essence Surge every 1 second for 3 seconds. This effect stacks and buffs Kryxis' damage. The boss will also fixate on a random player and begin to cast Juggernaut Rush. This works very similar to Akali's Barrel Through in King's Rest. The targeted player will want to position themselves so that the other party members can help soak the charge and reduce the damage. Our final ability is Severing Smash. At 100 energy, Kryxis the Voracious emits a massive wave of force outwards, inflicting shadow damage and knocking players back. Again, mind the edge. Each player leaves an orb of living essence behind. If Kryxis touches the orb, he is healed for 12% of his maximum health and gains an application of Essence Surge. If a player touches the orb, it inflicts shadow damage to them. On Mythic difficulty and higher, touching an orb will cause all party members to take the damage. This means you will want to either CD through it or stagger the explosions. The TLDR for this fight is tanks mitigate the headbutt damage, ensure the group helps soak Juggernaut Rush, and pick up the orbs before the boss does. Stagger collecting the orbs on Mythic difficulty and higher, and avoid killing your friends. On Heroic and below, just collect your own orb as soon as you can, if you will live the burst. Always mind the edge, you can and will get knocked off if too close. On your way to the second boss, you will encounter Wicked Oppressor. They will mainly cast Rack Soul. You may want to interrupt this to reduce the amount of shadow damage going out. However, Curse of Suppression needs to also be interrupted, since it will silence the target for 5 seconds. Dark Alkalite. They will cast Dark Bolt, which is a generic spellcast. You can stop it if you want to, but remember there are higher priorities. Chamber Sentinel. These gargoyle type mobs can be pretty deadly. Severing Slice is a frontal cone ability that will deal physical damage and leave behind a bleed effect. Tanks, do your best to face these away from party members. Craggy Fracture causes spikes to erupt under players' feet. sidestep out of them, or take massive physical damage and be knocked upwards. If alive long enough, the Sentinels will cast Stone Skin. This needs to be interrupted or the mob will take 65% reduced physical damage for 15 seconds. Grand Overseer. They will cast Gloom Burst, which will blast the enemy with shadow damage, however you can interrupt this. These mobs will have an aura around them, overbearing presence. This will slowly reduce the amount of healing and damage your party does, so deal with these guys first. If you find yourself chained to the mob, you are a victim of Dread Chains. Running away will break the chain. Head Custodian Javelin. This is the mob that can motivate the grubby Dirt Crunchers. Once motivated, Dirt Cruncher's haste will increase by 100% and its health will increase by 300%. The two main abilities to look out for from Javelin is Sweeping Slash and Bludgeoning Bash. The Slash is a frontal physical attack that knocks players backwards. This is telegraphed with a large tornado. Do not stand in the tornado. The Bash is a bit more deadly as this will disorient the player for 5 seconds. Bludgeoning Bash does cause the tank to drop threat, so be ready. Research Scribe will mainly throw research at you. Occasionally they will summon an explosive vellum. This is a large fiery swirl on the ground. Do not stand inside it. If near a prison cell, the scribe will also open it with Release Specimen. The Depths Warden casts Crushing Strike. It will deal some physical damage to the tank, nothing too drastic. Barbed Shackles is an interruptible spell, and if successful will root the target in place while dealing physical damage for 10 seconds. Infused Quill Feather will only cast Fiery Cantrip. Interrupt this to limit the amount of fire damage going out. The Remnant of Fury resides inside the prison cells and are sometimes released via the Research Scribes. Overflowing Rage is telegraphed by a large red swirly and will deal shadow damage to anyone within the blast. Explosive Anger fills the target with overflowing madness, inflicting shadow damage every 1 second, but also increases damage done by 25% for 8 seconds. Upon expiration, the player will explode, inflicting shadow damage to themselves and all nearby party members. Unless you can immune or mitigate the explosion, it's probably not worth the 8 seconds of increased damage, and your party should just interrupt the cast. Vestige of Doubt will cast Crushing Doubt. This affects all party members with negative thoughts, reducing movement speed and inflicts shadow damage for 15 seconds. This can stack and is a high priority on the interrupt list. Growing Mistrust is a ground effect that expands and deals ticking damage to any player struck. Executor Tarvold is our second boss. He will summon an ad throughout the fight, and the pool this ad drops acts like a pseudo enrage because eventually you will run out of room. There is no tank buster, so you can focus mainly on picking up the ads and positioning the boss. Tarvold will cast Castigate on a random player and cause them to pulsate damage to anyone within 8 yards. Move out of range of your friends if you do not want them to perish. Now for the summoned ads, these fleeting manifestations will deal pulsing damage with Growing Pride to all party members while alive, so you want to kill these off very quickly. However, upon expiration or reaching 100 energy, fleeting manifestations will drop that pool of residue, similar to the Vestige of Doubt. These pools grow quite large, but it's based on the amount of energy that they had when they died. This will force your party to move around. As stated before, kill these ads off as quickly as possible to keep the pools smaller and to minimize the AoE pulse damage going out. Now on Mythic difficulty and higher, Tarvold will create 2 orbs of anima that orbit the prison. Touching an orb inflicts shadow damage and leaves a dot that ticks every 1.5 seconds for 12 seconds. In addition, players struck will have their haste reduced by 25% for the duration. Now I recommend pulling the boss back away from the starting position. This will cause the orbs that rotate to not overlap and allow your party enough time to safely dodge the mechanic. The TLDR for this fight, be on your toes. If you are on Mythic difficulty or higher, avoid the orbiting orbs of anima. Deal with the ads as quickly as possible to minimize AoE damage going out and to reduce the size of the residue pools they drop. Avoid standing in the pools and spread out away from the target of castigation, and that's pretty much it. On your way to the third boss, you will encounter nothing new, a few wicked oppressors and a vestige of doubt. And for our third boss, Grand Proctor Beryllia. It's a very simple fight with basic mechanics. The tank buster here is Iron Spikes. Grand Proctor Beryllia summons forth 4 iron spikes that impale her current target over 2 seconds. Each spike inflicts physical damage and should be mitigated. Now if you look around the room, you may notice that there is a Naru being held captive and Beryllia is torturing it. This Endless Torment Torture cast causes the Naru to release waves of pain that inflict holy damage to all players, and unleash Anguished Cries every 0.5 seconds for 5 seconds. Anguished Cries are bolts of holy light that burst from the Naru, inflicting holy damage to all players within 5 yards of the impact, and an additional holy damage every 1.5 seconds for 12 seconds. Periodically, Beryllia will cast Agonize on a random player. This is an instant cast that brands a player with a painful mark, inflicting shadow damage every 2 seconds for 6 seconds. Now, throughout the fight, you will notice the boss gaining energy. Upon reaching 100 energy, Grand Proctor Beryllia will start to cast Rite of Supremacy. This will deal massive AoE damage and will likely one-shot you on higher keys. Luckily, the Naru aids us, and on heroic difficulty and lower will provide a bubble of protection. Stand inside the Shining Radiance to reduce the incoming damage. On mythic difficulty and higher, the Naru will release 15 fragments of radiance instead. Players should aim to pick up at least 3 each, since each fragment will reduce the damage of Rite of Supremacy by 20%. Immunities and other mitigation works as well. The TLDR for this fight is very straightforward. Tanks mitigate iron spikes, and as a group remember to pick up fragments of radiance to mitigate the damage from Rite of Supremacy. Healers be mindful of players afflicted by Agonize, as they may need some extra love when the mechanics overlap. Now, upon defeating Beryllia, do not forget to pick up the Naru's Beacon. This will be used throughout the rest of the dungeon, and anyone can pick it up, but it's best left to a tank or a healer. And on your way to the last boss, you will mostly encounter repeat mobs, however there are 2 new ones. Stonewall Gargons will be encountered first. Their only ability is Thrash. This deals physical damage, and as it stands, the tooltip says to all players within 8 yards. What this means is there is no need to try and face them away, but keep an eye out for changes. If it becomes a frontal only ability, then you will want to aim them away from your party members. Now, before you reach the final boss, you will have to endure the Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is comprised of repeat mobs that we already know about, however you must also whittle down the final boss, General Kaal. This can get a little hectic, and the faster you push the general, the easier the packs are. Stonewall Gargons will continuously spawn and run forward, keeping you in combat, but the larger packs will remain stationary until engaged. General Kaal will also retreat back every time she loses 10% of her health. She will fully retreat at 70% health, but while she is alive and active, she will occasionally cast a volley of uninterruptible shadow damage. She will also charge players and cast Gloom Squall. Now, this is where the beacon that the tank or the healer picked up earlier comes into play. Gloom Squall will deal massive damage and knock all players backwards, potentially into more mobs or off the ledge. To prevent this, the player holding the beacon must use their extra action button to drop a Shining Radiance barrier. Inside this barrier, you will take reduced damage and be immune to knockbacks. The second new mob you will encounter is the Sanguine Cadet. These mobs bolster each other with their aura unified front. Damage is increased by 20% for each cadet within 10 yards. However, they do not have a lot of health comparatively, so these are nothing to write home about. Continue the onslaught and make your way to the final boss. The final boss is General Kaal. Now, we have already met her and whittled her down to 70% health. Now it's time to bring her down another 20%. That is right, the fight ends when Kaal reaches 50% health. The only mechanic we have not seen yet is Piercing Blur. General Kaal creates an after image of herself which rushes forward in a straight, predetermined line, inflicting physical damage to all players caught in the path. On Mythic difficulty and higher, there will be 3 images to dodge. The group should remain loosely spread to avoid taking extra damage from Wicked Rush. Kaal will mark players to charge, and after a few seconds, she rushes them, attacking all players within 5 yards of the charged player's location, leaving behind Wicked Gash. This bleed will last for 20 seconds on normal and heroic mode, but on Mythic difficulty and higher, Wicked Gash will remain until the end of the fight unless it is removed via Shining Radiance. Speaking of Shining Radiance, as a tank, positioning can be important here. As we learned earlier, Gloom Squall releases a large powerful blast of anima-infused wind, inflicting shadow damage and knocking all enemies back. Since you are fighting on a small platform, this will cause you to be launched off. It is imperative that you drop your Shining Radiance beacon with enough time for players to move inside. Remember, standing inside the barrier will not only reduce the damage taken by 65%, it will also remove applications of Wicked Gash and make players immune to knockbacks. The TLDR for this fight is to dodge Piercing Blur, avoid stacking when Wicked rushes out, and make sure you're standing inside Shining Radiance when Gloom Squall goes off. That's it for this guide, folks. I appreciate you watching it. I hope you learned something. Remember to leave a big thumbs up, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay frosty.